The silver spoon trembled against fine china as Benedict Hallowell raised the pewter bowl to his lips, unaware that his cook had just served him his final meal. In the sweltering kitchen below, Dinah wiped her hands clean on her apron, knowing that by morning, the master of Hallowell Manor would never again taste anything at all. This is the story of how one enslaved woman turned the very tools of her oppression into instruments of liberation, and how a single bowl of stew changed the course of multiple lives forever. The scent of wood smoke and lye soap hung heavy in the August air of 1823 as Dinah descended the narrow servants' stairs into the basement kitchen of the Grand Manor. The brick walls sweated with humidity, and the rough-hewn floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she moved between the massive hearth and the scarred wooden preparation table that had witnessed countless meals and countless horrors over the past decade. Richmond, Virginia, in the early 1820s, was a city built on contradictions. Cobblestone streets echoed with the clip-clop of fine carriages carrying wealthy merchants to their counting houses, while just blocks away, the auction blocks displayed human beings like livestock. The James River carried both tobacco wealth downstream and the dreams of freedom upstream, depending on which side of the current you found yourself swimming. Hallowell Manor sat perched on Church Hill, like a white-pillared monument to prosperity built on suffering. Benedict Hallowell had inherited both the house and its human property from his father, along with a reputation for cruelty that even other slaveholders whispered about behind closed doors. The 42-year-old master of the house took particular pleasure in what he called discipline, though Dinah knew there was nothing disciplined about his random fits of violence. She had been cooking in this kitchen for 8 years, ever since her previous owner's death had placed her on the auction block at age 17. Her skilled hands could transform the coarsest cuts of meat into delicacies fit for the finest tables in Richmond, a talent that had saved her from the even worse fate of field work. But skill in the kitchen came with its own dangers. Proximity to the master meant proximity to his moods, his desires, and his fists. File notation: August 15th, 1823. Dinah exhibits exceptional culinary abilities, particularly with herb preparation and meat tenderization. Value: assessed at $800. Hallowell Estate Records. The kitchen had become Dinah's domain through necessity rather than choice. She knew every knife's edge, every pot's temperament, every spice's potency. The other enslaved people of the household: Prudence, who tended the gardens; Cyrus, who maintained the stables; and Helena, who served as lady's maid to Benedict's wife, Cordelia, all understood that Dinah's kitchen was both sanctuary and trap. It was the one place where she held a measure of control, where her knowledge was indispensable, but also where she faced the greatest daily contact with those who owned her. The hierarchy of the household was as rigid as the social order of the city itself. Above stairs lived the Hallowell family and their frequent guests merchants like Dorian Wexford, who supplied the finest imported goods, and socialites like Aurelia Coldenwell, whose garden parties were legendary among Richmond's elite. Below stairs existed a different world entirely, one where survival depended on reading the subtle signs of impending violence and knowing exactly how to fade into the background when tempers flared. But Dinah had grown tired of fading. 3 weeks earlier, Benedict had beaten Prudence unconscious for allowing aphids to damage his prized roses. 2 months before that, he had sold Helena's 10-year-old son to a plantation in Georgia after the child had accidentally broken a crystal glass. The breaking point, however, had come just 5 days ago, when Cyrus had been found hanged in the stables, officially ruled a suicide by the local constable. Though everyone in the household knew the truth about the rope burns on his wrists and the fear in his eyes the night before, some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. As Dinah moved through her evening preparations, her movements carried the weight of a decision that had been building for months. The knowledge she had accumulated over 8 years of cooking not just recipes and techniques, but the deeper understanding of what the human body could and could not withstand, would finally serve a purpose beyond feeding those who had never seen her as human. The irony was not lost on her that in a house where she was forbidden to read, forbidden to write, forbidden even to look directly at her owners, she had become the most educated person when it came to matters of life and death. Every herb in Prudence's garden, every root in the cellar, every powder in the spice cabinet, Dinah understood their properties with the precision of an apothecary. Tonight, that education would be put to its ultimate test. As the grandfather clock in the hallway above chimed 7 times, Dinah began assembling the ingredients for what would become the most significant meal in Hollowell Manor's history. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was already racing ahead to the consequences of what she was about to do. In a world where enslaved people had been hanged for far lesser acts of defiance, she was preparing to commit what the law would certainly call murder. But as she glanced through the kitchen window at the quarters where Prudence still bore the scars of her beating, where Helena grieved for her lost son, where Cyrus's empty bed served as a reminder of Benedict's capacity for cruelty, Dinah found herself wondering about a different question entirely. What separated justice from murder when the law itself was the greatest crime of all? The pewter pot began to bubble on the fire, and with it, the final act of a drama that would transform not just one household, but the very understanding of power in the heart of the Old Dominion. The dried foxglove leaves crumbled between Dinah's fingers like ancient parchment, releasing their sweet, deceptively innocent scent into the humid kitchen air. She had learned to identify this particular plant not from any cookbook, but from watching her mother die slowly in a Georgia cabin 12 years earlier, her heart racing and stuttering until it simply stopped. Understanding the line between medicine and murder had become Dinah's most dangerous skill, and tonight it would become her salvation. The basement storage room reeked of damp earth and aged wood as Dinah moved between the shelves of preserved foods and medicinal supplies that Cordelia Hollowell insisted on maintaining for the household. The rough stone walls seemed to absorb sound, creating a tomb-like silence broken only by the scratch of rats in the walls and the distant murmur of conversation from the dining room above. Her calloused fingers traced along glass jars filled with dried herbs, each one a memory of lessons learned through necessity rather than formal education. In the slave quarters of her childhood, Dinah's mother had been known as a root woman, someone who could ease a difficult birth, calm a fevered child, or help an old man die with dignity when his time came. The knowledge had been passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes meant knowing which plants healed and which plants killed, and more importantly, knowing that the difference was often simply a matter of dosage. Inventory record, March 10th, 1823. Medicinal supplies include Digitalis purpurea, Aconitum, Napellus, and various tinctures for household use. Hollowell Manor Estate Ledger. The irony was bitter, as spoiled milk Benedict Hollowell had purchased Dinah specifically because her previous owner had praised her knowledge of kitchen physic, never realizing that he was bringing a living pharmacy into his home. For 8 years, she had used her knowledge to heal, brewing willow bark tea for Prudence's aching joints, preparing chamomile tinctures to help Helena sleep after particularly brutal days, creating poultices to help Cyrus's whip marks heal without infection. But every plant that could heal could also harm. Dinah's education had continued even in bondage, though not in ways her captors intended. She observed which guests complained of stomach ailments after rich meals, noted how certain combinations of foods affected different constitutions, memorized the precise timing of when various symptoms appeared. The wealthy visitors to Hollowell Manor became unwitting test subjects for her growing understanding of human physiology. Dorian Wexford, the portly spice merchant, invariably suffered severe indigestion when served dishes heavy in black pepper. Aurelia Coldenwell's delicate constitution couldn't tolerate even small amounts of nutmeg without developing violent headaches. Ignatius Bramblefield, Benedict's business partner in several shipping ventures, had such sensitivity to certain mushrooms that even the smallest portion left him bedridden for days. Knowledge accumulated like sediment. The sound of footsteps on the kitchen stairs interrupted her preparations. Helena descended into the dim space, her normally composed expression tight with worry. At 31, she had survived in the Hollowell household longer than most by perfecting the art of invisible service. But tonight, something had shaken her careful composure. "Master's asking for his evening stew," Helena whispered, glancing toward the stairs as if Benedict might materialize at any moment. "Says he wants it served in his study while he reviews the shipping ledgers. Mrs. Cordelia is taking her dinner in the garden room with Millicent Rosewell. They're discussing the arrangements for next week's dinner party." The timing was perfect, almost as if the universe itself was conspiring to provide the ideal circumstances. Benedict would be alone in his study, isolated from witnesses, consuming his meal while focused on business documents that would hold his complete attention. "Tell him it will be ready within the quarter hour," Dinah replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. As Helena's footsteps retreated up the stairs, Dinah returned to her deadly calculus. The dried leaves of digitalis foxglove would provide the primary mechanism. In small doses, it could regulate an irregular heartbeat. In larger amounts, it would cause the heart to race uncontrollably before stopping entirely. But digitalis alone was too unpredictable, too likely to be detected by its characteristic bitter taste. The poison needed companions. Some knowledge comes at too high a price. From the garden stores, she selected aconite root wolfsbane, which would mask the foxglove's bitterness while adding its own lethal contribution. The combination would create symptoms that could easily be attributed to apoplexy or heart failure, conditions not uncommon among men of Benedict's age and temperament. To further obscure detection, she would add a generous helping of elderberry preserves, whose dark color and strong flavor would hide any telltale discoloration. As she began grinding the dried plants with a marble mortar and pestle that had been used countless times for innocent seasonings, Dinah found herself thinking about the broader implications of her actions. In the eyes of Virginia law, she was committing not just murder, but the specific crime of poisoning one's master, an offense that carried not just the death penalty, but public execution designed to serve as a warning to other enslaved people who might harbor similar thoughts. Yet what choice did she have? Escape was virtually impossible for a woman traveling alone, and even if she succeeded, the other members of the household would face Benedict's wrath in her absence. Prudence, still recovering from her beating, could not survive another such assault. Helena lived in constant fear that her surviving daughter would be sold away as her son had been. The law that condemned Dinah's actions was the same law that treated her as property, that gave Benedict absolute authority over her life and death, that turned human beings into commodities to be bought and sold at will. In such a system, was there any meaningful distinction between justice and criminality? The stew pot bubbled gently as she stirred in the final ingredients, the deadly herbs now indistinguishable from the beef, vegetables, and aromatic spices that would make this Benedict's most memorable meal. The familiar motions of cooking motions she had performed thousands of times in service to those who owned her now carried the weight of revolution. But as she ladled the poisoned stew into Benedict's finest pewter bowl, a new concern began to gnaw at her consciousness. What if someone else tasted the dish? What if Cordelia decided to join her husband unexpectedly? Or if one of the other household members was commanded to sample the food for quality? The kitchen door opened above, and Benedict's voice boomed down the stairs with the casual cruelty that had defined 8 years of Dinah's existence. "Girl, bring that stew up here before it turns cold as your heart," Benedict's voice thundered down the narrow stairs, each word dripping with the casual contempt that had seasoned 8 years of Dinah's servitude. She lifted the pewter bowl with hands that refused to tremble, knowing that the next few minutes would either end her bondage or end her life. The weight of that bowl carried the accumulated rage of every enslaved person who had ever been forced to smile while serving those who brutalized them. The mahogany floorboards of the main hall groaned softly under Dinah's bare feet as she ascended from the kitchen's humid depths into the refined atmosphere of the manor's upper floors. Crystal chandelier light danced across oil portraits of dead Halliwells, their painted eyes seeming to track her movement as she navigated the familiar path to Benedict's private study. The air here smelled of beeswax polish and tobacco smoke, a sharp contrast to the earthier scents of the basement kitchen. Benedict's study occupied the southeast corner of the manor, its tall windows offering a commanding view of the James River and the tobacco warehouses that had built the Halliwell fortune. The room served as both office and sanctuary, filled with leather-bound ledgers, maritime charts, and the tools of a man who traded in human misery as casually as others traded in cotton or corn. Ship manifests lay scattered across his desk, alongside correspondence from plantation owners seeking to purchase prime breeding stock and seasoned field hands. At precisely 8:47 p.m., Dinah knocked twice on the heavy oak door. "Enter," came the gruff reply. Benedict sat hunched over his account books, his thick fingers stained with ink as he calculated profits from his latest human cargo shipment. At 42, he had grown soft around the middle, from rich food and excess, but his arms still carried the muscle memory of violence. A half-empty bottle of French brandy sat within easy reach, its contents having already loosened his tongue and shortened his temper. "Set it there," he commanded without looking up, gesturing toward a side table positioned near his reading chair. "And stir the fire while you're at it. This dampness chills my bones." The irony was not lost on Dinah that Benedict complained of being cold while she had spent 8 years wondering if she would survive each scorching summer and bitter winter with barely adequate clothing and shelter. She placed the bowl carefully on its designated spot, noting how the pewter reflected the firelight in patterns that seemed almost prophetic. As she knelt before the hearth and stirred the dying coals back to life, Benedict finally abandoned his ledgers and settled into his leather chair. The cushions wheezed under his weight as he reached for the spoon sterling silver, naturally, because even his eating utensils had to reinforce the hierarchy that placed him above those who prepared his food. "Smells rich tonight," he mumbled, raising the first spoonful to his lips. "What did you season it with?" "The usual herbs, master," Dinah replied, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality that had kept her alive for 8 years. "Thyme, rosemary, bay leaves from the garden." She did not mention the foxglove, the wolfsbane, or the elderberry preserves that would mask their bitter bite. Benedict consumed the stew with the mechanical efficiency of a man more interested in fuel than flavor. He paused occasionally to wash down the meat and vegetables with generous swallows of brandy, a combination that would only accelerate the absorption of the deadly alkaloids now entering his bloodstream. Correspondence dated August 20th, 1823. The Richmond market remains favorable for prime field hands. Recommend increasing acquisition volume for autumn shipping season. Letter fragment found in Benedict's study. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked 9:15 p.m. as Benedict scraped the bottom of the bowl clean. Dinah had calculated that the first symptoms should begin manifesting within 30 to 45 minutes, depending on his constitution and the amount of alcohol in his system. She busied herself with unnecessary tidying, adjusting the fire screen, straightening papers on his desk, polishing already gleaming brass fixtures, anything to justify remaining in the room without arousing suspicion. Benedict returned to his ledgers, apparently satisfied with his meal. He worked in silence, save for the occasional grunt of approval or disapproval as he reviewed shipping schedules and profit margins. The mundane nature of the scene struck Dinah as almost surreal. Here was a man calculating the monetary value of human souls while the instruments of his own judgment dissolved in his stomach. But as the minutes ticked by, doubt began creeping into her consciousness like fog rolling off the James River. What if she had miscalculated the dosage? What if Benedict's constitution was stronger than she had estimated? What if years of heavy drinking had built up his tolerance to toxins? Death was taking its time. At 9:37 p.m., Benedict set down his quill and rubbed his temples with thick fingers. "Confounded headache," he muttered. "This humid weather plays havoc with a man's constitution." Dinah felt her pulse quicken. The headaches were often the first sign the digitalis beginning its deadly work on his cardiovascular system. She forced herself to maintain the appearance of dutiful service, while internally cataloging each symptom as it appeared. "Perhaps Master should retire early tonight," she suggested, with practiced concern. "The heat has been oppressive today." Benedict waved dismissively. "Nonsense. I have 3 more shipping contracts to review before morning." He reached for his brandy glass but paused, his hand trembling slightly. "Strange. My fingers feel numb." The numbness would spread, Dinah knew. First the extremities, then the face. Finally the throat and chest, as his nervous system succumbed to the botanical assassins, now coursing through his veins. But she also knew that the process could take hours, hours during which Benedict might cry out for help, might summon a physician, might survive long enough to identify the source of his suffering. Some plans require more patience than courage. As if summoned by her fears, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the study. Cordelia's voice drifted through the door, accompanied by the lighter tones of Millicent Rosewell, her dinner guest. "Benedict, darling, are you still working?" Millicent was hoping to discuss the flower arrangements for Saturday's gathering before she departs. The door handle turned slowly, and Dinah realized that her carefully orchestrated evening was about to become infinitely more complicated. Cordelia Hollowell's silk skirts rustled against the doorframe like autumn leaves as she swept into the study, her ivory fan fluttering in the humid air, completely unaware that she was about to witness the final act of her husband's life. Behind her, Millicent Rosewell's pearl-adorned throat caught the lamplight as she prepared to discuss flower arrangements with a man whose heart was already beginning its fatal dance. The arrival of witnesses transformed Dinah's calculated murder into a deadly performance, where every gesture and word would determine not just Benedict's fate, but her own survival. The scent of Cordelia's rosewater perfume mingled with the leather and tobacco smoke of the study as the 2 women settled into the conversation area near Benedict's desk. Millicent, resplendent in emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair, carried herself with the practiced grace of Richmond's social elite. At 28, she had mastered the art of meaningful conversation about meaningless topics, a skill that would serve her poorly in recognizing the medical crisis unfolding before her eyes. Benedict struggled to rise from his chair as etiquette demanded, but his legs betrayed him with a tremor that he disguised as fatigue. "Ladies, forgive me. This confounded heat has left me somewhat indisposed." Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the evening's relative coolness, and his normally ruddy complexion had taken on a grayish pallor that Dinah recognized as the poison's progression. "Perhaps we should postpone our discussion," Millicent suggested, her trained eye noting Benedict's obvious distress. "You appear quite piqued, sir." "Nonsense," Benedict replied, though his voice carried a hoarseness that hadn't been present an hour earlier. "A bit of indigestion, nothing more. Dinah's cooking has grown rather heavy-handed of late." The accusation struck like a physical blow, but Dinah maintained her expression of humble concern while internally calculating how quickly the symptoms would worsen. The digitalis would affect his heart first, causing palpitations and irregular rhythm. The aconite would follow with numbness and respiratory distress. Both toxins working in concert would create a cascade of organ failure that no physician in 1823 could reverse. Cordelia fanned herself delicately while studying her husband with a detached observation of a woman long accustomed to his various ailments and excuses. At 35, she had learned to navigate marriage to Benedict through strategic ignorance. Acknowledging his brutalities toward the enslaved staff would require actions she was unprepared to take, so she had perfected the art of selective blindness. Medical Journal entry, August 18, 1823. Patient presents with acute gastric distress following evening meal. Symptoms include perspiration, tremor, and pallor. Recommend bloodletting and purging. Dr. Winthrop Ashford's notes. But tonight, ignorance would prove impossible to maintain. Benedict attempted to pour himself another measure of brandy, but his hands shook so violently that amber liquid splashed across his shipping ledgers. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, crystal fragments scattering like frozen tears. "Good Lord," Millicent gasped, rising from her seat. "Mr. Hollowell, you're quite ill." The sound of breaking glass had masked another noise. Benedict's labored breathing as his respiratory system began responding to the botanical assault. His chest rose and fell with increasing effort, each breath a visible struggle against the paralysis creeping through his nervous system. Dinah moved swiftly to clean the broken glass, using the task as cover to observe Benedict's condition. His pulse, visible now in the throbbing vein at his temple, had become rapid and irregular. The numbness he had mentioned earlier would be spreading from his fingers toward his core, and soon he would lose the ability to speak clearly. "Shall I fetch Dr. Ashford?" Dinah asked, knowing that the elderly physician lived nearly 2 miles away and would require at least 40 minutes to arrive, time Benedict no longer possessed. "No," Benedict gasped, gripping the arms of his chair. "Just need air." His words came in short bursts as his diaphragm fought against the chemical paralysis spreading through his system. "Window. Open the..." Cordelia and Millicent exchanged glances of mounting alarm. This was clearly beyond simple indigestion or fatigue. Benedict's skin had taken on a waxy sheen, and his eyes, usually sharp with calculated cruelty, now carried the unfocused gaze of a man whose brain was receiving insufficient oxygen. Some performances require the audience to remain ignorant. As Dinah moved to open the tall windows overlooking the James River, she caught sight of Helena crossing the courtyard below, carrying linens toward the wash-house. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and Helena's expression shifted from routine duty to alert concern. She had worked in this household long enough to recognize the signs of crisis, though she could not have guessed its true nature. The night air that flowed through the open windows carried the scent of river mud and tobacco flowers, but did nothing to ease Benedict's respiratory distress. If anything, the cooler air seemed to highlight the fever building in his system as his body fought desperately against the botanical invaders. "Perhaps we should help you to bed," Cordelia suggested, though her voice carried more social obligation than genuine concern. Her marriage had been arranged for financial advantage, and Benedict's health mattered primarily insofar as it affected her social standing and economic security. Benedict attempted to stand, but collapsed back into his chair, his legs no longer capable of supporting his weight. The digitalis had reached his cardiac muscle in earnest now, forcing his heart into a rhythm that alternated between racing and stuttering. Sweat poured down his face as his body temperature fluctuated wildly. Can't breathe properly," he wheezed, his hand clawing at his throat as if trying to tear away an invisible noose. Millicent rushed to his side with the dramatic flair of a woman who had read too many Gothic novels and too few medical texts. "Mr. Hollowell, try to remain calm. Panic will only worsen your condition." But this was not panic. This was the methodical shutdown of a human body as carefully orchestrated as any military campaign. Dinah watched the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a general observing a successful siege, noting each stage of the poison's progression while maintaining her mask of concerned servitude. The question that haunted her now was not whether Benedict would survive. The outcome was already certain, but whether she could guide these witnesses through his death. without arousing suspicions that would lead to her own execution. As Benedict's breathing became increasingly labored and his consciousness began to flicker like a candle in a storm, the true test of Dinah's deadly education was about to begin. Benedict's final breath rattled through the study like chains dragging across cobblestone, while Cordelia stood frozen in horror and Millicent clutched her pearls in theatrical shock. In that moment of stunned silence, Dinah realized that the most dangerous part of her plan was not the poisoning itself, but convincing two privileged white women that they had witnessed a natural death rather than calculated murder. The next few minutes would determine whether justice had been served or whether the gallows awaited. The acrid smell of death began to mingle with the study's familiar sense of leather and tobacco as Benedict's body released the final evidence of his mortality. His bowels had loosened in the ultimate indignity, though neither Cordelia nor Millicent yet understood the clinical significance of what they were witnessing. Dinah had seen death before too many times in the slave quarters where medical attention was scarce and suffering was ignored. But this was the first death she had authored with her own hands. At 10:23 p.m., Benedict Hallowell's heart finally surrendered to the botanical assault that had been building in his system for over an hour. His eyes, still open but already filming over with the glassy stare of the departed, reflected the lamplight like dark mirrors. The transformation from tyrant to corpse had taken less than 90 minutes, a remarkably efficient execution by any standard. "Oh, merciful Lord," Millicent whispered, sinking into the nearest chair with the boneless collapse of a woman whose sheltered existence had never prepared her for witnessing death. Has he? Cordelia approached her husband's body with the cautious steps of someone who had long expected this moment, but had never quite believed it would arrive. At 35, she possessed enough practical experience to recognize death when she saw it, though the suddenness clearly unsettled her composed facade. "He's gone," she confirmed, her voice carrying more bewilderment than grief. But how? He was complaining of indigestion just moments ago. This was Dinah's crucial moment. Everything depended on guiding these women toward an explanation that would satisfy both their limited medical knowledge and their need to make sense of the inexplicable. She moved toward Benedict's body with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing household crises. "Master always had trouble with his heart," Dinah said quietly, placing a gentle finger against Benedict's wrist in a pantomime of checking for pulse she knew no longer existed. "Dr. Ashford warned him last winter about the dangers of rich food and strong drink, said his constitution couldn't bear the strain much longer." The lie came easily because it was built on a foundation of partial truth. Dr. Ashford had indeed cautioned Benedict about his lifestyle, though more in the context of general health than imminent cardiac failure. But Dinah understood that grief and shock made people eager to accept explanations that fit their existing understanding of the world. Coroner's report, August 24, 1823. Subject expired of apparent heart failure. No signs of violence or suspicious circumstances observed. Richmond City Records. Millicent dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though her tears seemed more reflexive than heartfelt. Poor man. And so sudden. He seemed in perfect health at dinner last week. Perfect health was an overstatement that Benedict himself would have disputed, but Dinah allowed it to stand unchallenged. The more these women convinced themselves that his death was both predictable and natural, the safer her own position became. Cordelia moved to close Benedict's eyes with trembling fingers, a gesture that struck Dinah as more theatrical than tender. "We must send for Dr. Ashford immediately, and the undertaker. There will be arrangements to make, people to notify." The practical concerns of death were already beginning to overshadow the emotional impact, which served Dinah's purposes perfectly. The busier these women became with social obligations and funeral preparations, the less likely they were to scrutinize the medical details of Benedict's demise. "Shall I wake Helena to help with the preparations?" Dinah asked, knowing that involving more household members would create additional witnesses to the apparent naturalness of Benedict's death. And perhaps Prudence could prepare the front parlor for receiving visitors? Some secrets hide best in plain sight. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Helena's soft knock echoed through the study door. Her intuitive understanding of household rhythms had alerted her to the crisis, and she entered with the cautious deference of someone who had learned to read dangerous situations from subtle cues. "Begging your pardon, Mrs.," Helena said, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. "I saw the lights burning late, and thought perhaps—" Her words trailed off as she noticed Benedict's still form in the leather chair. Unlike the white women who had witnessed his final moments, Helena possessed the practical knowledge of someone who had attended multiple deathbeds. Her quick scan of the body, the room, and Dinah's composed demeanor told a story that the others could not read. But Helena's expression revealed nothing beyond appropriate sorrow and concern. In the complex dance of survival that governed the enslaved household, she understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to acknowledge, even to oneself. "Master Hallowell has passed," Cordelia announced, her voice taking on the formal cadence required for such pronouncements. "It appears his heart finally succumbed to the strain Dr. Ashford warned us about." Helena lowered her eyes respectfully. "My condolences, Mrs. Shall I begin preparing the house for mourning?" The normalcy of the exchange felt surreal to Dinah, who stood in the presence of her victim's corpse while planning his funeral arrangements. But this was how power structures preserve themselves, through the collective agreement to maintain appearances even when reality had shifted beneath everyone's feet. As Helena began organizing the immediate tasks required by death, and Millicent departed to spread word of Benedict's demise through Richmond's social networks, Dinah found herself alone with Cordelia and the corpse that had once owned them both. "You served him faithfully," Cordelia said quietly, though whether she spoke to Dinah or to the memory of her marriage was unclear. "He always said your cooking was exceptional." The unintended irony of the compliment nearly broke Dinah's carefully maintained composure, but she managed a humble nod while internally savoring the bitter satisfaction of having her deadly skills acknowledged, however unknowingly. But as the grandfather clock chimed 11 times, and the reality of Benedict's death began settling over Hallowell Manor like morning fog, Dinah realized that surviving the murder had been only the first challenge. Now came the far more dangerous task of living with the consequences. Dr. Winthrop Ashford's weathered hands pressed against Benedict's cold neck, searching for a pulse that had been absent for nearly 3 hours, while Dinah stood in the corner of the study watching the elderly physician unknowingly validate her perfect crime. The candlelight flickered across his spectacles as he conducted his examination, completely unaware that he was being observed by the architect of the death he was about to certify as natural. This was the moment when Dinah's botanical education would either secure her freedom or seal her fate on the gallows. The pre-dawn hours of August 24th brought an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the manor's walls like creeping dread. Dr. Ashford had arrived at 2:17 a.m., summoned from his bed by Cordelia's urgent message, his medical bag clutched in arthritic fingers and his white hair disheveled from sleep. At 71, he had attended enough deathbeds to recognize the signs of cardiac failure. But his examination would determine whether Benedict's demise appeared sufficiently natural to avoid further scrutiny. The study had been transformed into an impromptu mortuary, with Benedict's body arranged in his chair as if he had simply dozed off while reviewing his ledgers. Helena had tidied the space with meticulous care, removing the broken brandy glass and straightening the scattered papers, creating a scene of peaceful passing rather than violent death. Dr. Ashford murmured, lifting Benedict's eyelids to examine the pupils with the clinical detachment of long medical practice. Dilated, but not uncommonly so for a man of his constitution. He pressed his ear against Benedict's chest, listening for sounds that would never come, then examined the fingernails for signs of cyanosis. Dinah held her breath as the physician's examination continued, She had gambled that the combination of digitalis and aconite would mimic the symptoms of heart failure closely enough to fool a country doctor with limited forensic knowledge. But Dr. Ashford's reputation for thoroughness was well established throughout Richmond's medical community. Correspondence dated August 24, 1823. Upon examination, deceased shows clear signs of cardiac arrest, no evidence of violence or suspicious circumstances. Natural causes confirmed. Dr. Ashford's official report. The relief that flooded through Dinah's body was so intense it nearly buckled her knees. Dr. Ashford's pronouncement would carry the weight of medical authority, effectively closing any potential investigation before it could begin. But she forced herself to maintain the composed expression of a grieving servant, knowing that even the slightest hint of satisfaction could arouse suspicion. I warned him repeatedly about his lifestyle, Dr. Ashford continued, addressing Cordelia with the weary tone of a physician whose advice had been ignored. The excessive drinking, the rich foods, the fits of temper. His heart was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Cordelia nodded with the appropriate gravity, though her relief was evident to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signs. Benedict's death, while sudden, would not bring scandal or investigation, merely sympathy and the social obligations of widowhood. "What of the household arrangements?" she asked, already thinking ahead to the practical matters that would shape her new circumstances. The staff, the property management, the business concerns? The question hung in the air like tobacco smoke, carrying implications that would determine the fate of everyone who had lived under Benedict's brutal authority. Dinah understood that the next few hours would reveal whether his death had truly liberated them or simply transferred their bondage to new masters. Helena entered quietly, with fresh linens and the supplies needed for preparing Benedict's body for burial. Her movements carried the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these grim tasks before, though never for a death she knew to be murder. As she began the delicate work of washing and dressing the corpse, her eyes met Dinah's with a look that conveyed both understanding and warning. Some secrets create bonds stronger than blood. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Ignatius Bramblefield, Benedict's business partner, who had been summoned to help settle the immediate concerns of the shipping enterprise. His tall frame filled the doorway as he surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of a man already assessing opportunities and vulnerabilities. "Tragic business," Bramblefield announced with perfunctory sympathy. Benedict was in his prime, relatively speaking. "His heart, you say?" "Dr. Ashford has confirmed it," Cordelia replied. "Natural causes brought on by his habits." Bramblefield's examination of the study was more thorough than the physician's had been, his merchant's eye cataloging the account books, correspondence, and shipping schedules that would need immediate attention. When his gaze fell on Dinah, she felt the weight of evaluation not as a person, but as a valuable asset whose future would be determined by economic rather than humanitarian considerations. "The household staff will need oversight during the transition," he mused aloud, "particularly the cook." Benedict always praised her skills quite highly. The casual discussion of her fate while she stood mere feet away encapsulated everything Dinah had sought to escape through Benedict's murder. Even in death, her former master's influence continued to reduce her to property to be managed and exploited. But as the gray light of dawn began filtering through the study windows, illuminating the scene of her perfect crime, Dinah realized that Benedict's death had created new dangers she had not fully anticipated. His absence would create a power vacuum that other predators would rush to fill, and her position as a skilled enslaved person made her valuable enough to fight over. The morning brought visitors bearing condolences and curiosity in equal measure. Dorian Wexford arrived with flowers and an unusually keen interest in Benedict's shipping contracts. Aurelia Coldenwell swept in with dramatic tears and subtle inquiries about the household's future arrangements. Each visitor represented a potential threat to the delicate fiction Dinah had constructed around Benedict's death. As she served refreshments to the stream of mourners, Dinah found herself studying their faces for signs of suspicion. But all she saw was the predictable behavior of people positioning themselves for advantage in the wake of a powerful man's demise. Benedict's tyranny had been so normalized that his sudden death sparked more greed than grief. The funeral was scheduled for August 27th, giving Cordelia 3 days to navigate the complex social and legal requirements of widowhood. But those same 3 days would also provide time for rumors to spread, for inconsistencies to emerge, for someone to ask the wrong questions about Benedict's final meal. As the sun climbed higher over Richmond and the James River, reflected the morning light like a sheet of hammered silver, Dinah understood that surviving Benedict's murder had only been the beginning of a much more dangerous game. The real test would be living long enough to taste the freedom she had killed for. The auctioneer's hammer fell with the finality of a coffin nail. As Dinah stood on the Richmond auction block 3 weeks after Benedict's funeral, her deadly knowledge now making her the most valuable and dangerous piece of property in Virginia. The crowd of potential buyers had no idea they were bidding on a woman who had already proven that the tools of servitude could become instruments of liberation and death. The question that haunted the packed auction house was not who would purchase Dinah, but whether her new master would survive long enough to enjoy his investment. The September heat pressed against the cobblestones of Broad Street like a suffocating blanket as hundreds of spectators gathered for what had become Richmond's most anticipated slave auction of the year. Word had spread through the city's merchant circles about Benedict Hallowell's exceptional cook, whose skills had earned legendary status among the wealthy families who had dined at his table. What they didn't know was that they were competing for a woman whose recipes included more than seasoning. Cordelia had moved swiftly to liquidate Benedict's human property, claiming financial necessity, though everyone understood her real motivation was removing reminders of her husband's brutalities. The legal proceedings had been expedited with unseemly haste, giving Dinah barely 3 weeks of precarious freedom before finding herself once again reduced to chattel. But those 3 weeks had been enough to plant seeds of doubt throughout Richmond's enslaved community. Helena, now sold to a tobacco merchant named Cyrus Draycott, had whispered carefully chosen words to other kitchen workers throughout the city. Prudence, purchased by the Rosewell family, had shared meaningful glances with house servants who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to speak aloud, but too important to forget. The message spread through the invisible networks that connected every plantation kitchen, every servant's quarter, every place where enslaved people gathered beyond their masters' watchful eyes. Benedict Hallowell had died after eating Dinah's stew, and perhaps some deaths were not as natural as they appeared. Auction record, September 15th, 1823. Dinah, age 25. Exceptional culinary skills. Sold to Dorian Wexford for $1,200. Andy 8. Highest price of the season. Richmond Slave Market Ledger. Dorian Wexford's winning bid surprised no one familiar with his obsession for acquiring the finest luxuries. The portly spice merchant had dined at Hallowell Manor multiple times and considered Dinah's cooking among the finest he had ever experienced. His household already employed a dozen enslaved people, but none possessed her specialized knowledge of herbs, seasonings, and the subtle chemistry that transformed raw ingredients into culinary masterpieces. As the shackles closed around Dinah's wrists for transport to her new prison, she caught sight of Dr. Ashford in the crowd. The elderly physician's eyes held a troubling intensity as he studied her face, and for a moment she wondered if his medical examination of Benedict had revealed more than his official report indicated. But Ashford said nothing, and the moment passed like smoke on the wind. The Wexford estate occupied a sprawling tract along the Chickahominy River, its brick mansion surrounded by warehouses filled with exotic spices imported from Asia, the Caribbean, and South America. Dorian's wealth had been built on understanding flavor the precise combinations that could transform ordinary dishes into extraordinary experiences. He viewed Dinah's acquisition as the final component in his quest to establish Richmond's most celebrated kitchen. He had no idea he was importing his own executioner. Dinah's integration into the Wexford household proceeded smoothly, her reputation preceding her like a letter of introduction. The other enslaved people treated her with the wary respect accorded to someone whose skills placed them in regular contact with the master. But within days, subtle changes began appearing in the social dynamics of the servant quarters. Conversations stopped when Dorian entered rooms. Food tasters, enslaved people, forced to sample dishes before serving them to white families, began finding excuses to avoid their duties. Kitchen workers started paying unusual attention to which herbs and spices were used in each meal, as if memorizing recipes for purposes that had nothing to do with cooking. Death had made Dinah a teacher. Some lessons spread faster than fever. The first sign of trouble came during Dorian's dinner party on October 3rd, when Aurelia Coldenwell complimented the seasoning in her soup and then asked, with apparent casualness, whether Dinah had prepared the entire meal. The question carried undertones that made the other dinner guests glance nervously at their plates, suddenly conscious of flavors they had been enjoying moments before. Dorian, still oblivious to the growing unease surrounding his prized cook, laughed off their concerns. "Gentlemen, you're allowing superstition to spoil perfectly good food. Dinah's cooking is exceptional. Nothing more." But that night, he ate only bread and cheese from his private stores. The pattern continued for weeks. Public praise for Dinah's culinary abilities, accompanied by private caution about consuming her creations. Richmond's elite found themselves caught between their desire for exceptional dining experiences and their growing awareness that Benedict Hollowell's sudden death had occurred shortly after praising his cook's latest creation. By November, Dorian's dinner invitations were being politely declined with increasing frequency. His business associates found reasons to conduct meetings at neutral locations rather than accepting his hospitality. The social isolation that followed created a prison more effective than any physical restraint. On November 27, 1823, Dorian Wexford was found dead in his study, slumped over account books that showed his spice importing business was failing due to the social stigma surrounding his household. Dr. Ashford's examination revealed heart failure brought on by what he termed nervous exhaustion and melancholia. No mention was made of the barely detectable bitter almond scent that lingered around the teacup on Dorian's desk, or the fact that his private food stores had been depleted in the weeks before his death. The official records show that Dinah was sold again within days of Dorian's funeral, purchased by a slave trader bound for the cotton plantations of Alabama. The bill of sale lists her age as 25 and her skills as general domestic work. No mention of cooking abilities that had once commanded premium prices. She vanished into the vast machinery of human bondage that ground countless lives to dust in the expanding cotton empire of the Deep South. But legends are harder to kill than people, and Dinah's story continued spreading through the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. Kitchen workers whispered about herbs that could kill as easily as heal. House servants learned to recognize the signs of botanical poisoning. Cooks discovered that knowledge could be the most dangerous weapon of all. The Richmond newspapers never reported the pattern of mysterious deaths that followed in the wake of particularly skilled kitchen staff, nor did they investigate why certain plantation owners began insisting that white overseers taste every meal before it reached the master's table. They say that even now, in the forgotten corners of Virginia, where old plantation houses crumble back into the earth, you can sometimes catch the scent of herbs cooking slow and low, seasoned with something that tastes like justice and smells like freedom. And if you know the old stories, if you remember the names that were never written in any official record, you might recognize the recipe that Dinah left behind, not written in any cookbook, but passed down through whispered words in kitchen corners, where the enslaved learned that sometimes the only path to liberation runs through the master's stomach. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.